Before I proceed with this video, first of all, my apologies for the very dim lighting conditions. I'm away from my usual place in London. I'm doing programs outside London in a town where I'm afraid I have to attend the funeral of a dear and beloved friend and a member of my family. But nonetheless, news continues, so I've decided to continue to do videos during this period. And I'm afraid the poor lighting conditions means that you don't see me so well. And it also means, by the way, that I can't read so well. And that's why I'm afraid I have to wear reading glasses. So bear with me as I try to cover the latest topics today. And the topic that I'm going to discuss today is a meeting that has just taken place in Moscow between Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergey Ryabkov and US Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs Ryabkov-Nuland. And this is, in my opinion, another example of how US diplomacy at this moment in time, far from making the situation for the United States and indeed for the world in general better, is actually contriving to make it worse. Now, let's just take a step back and consider the conditions in which this meeting is taking place. As we all remember, the Biden-Harris administration came into office in January, promising to take a very strong line against Russia. Russia was being criticized for interfering in US elections, for its disruptive and supposedly dangerous and destabilizing activities. It has been the target of unending waves of sanctions, and there's been all kinds of problems building up in the US-Russia relationship going back now many years, certainly back in a really serious way to the Obama era. And various attempts by various American political leaders like Donald Trump, for example, to turn things round, to make things better, have all come to a horrible end. Now, when the Biden-Harris administration came to office, it looked as if this hard line was not only going to be continued, it looked as if it was going to be intensified. However, two things started to happen. Firstly, it became clear that the Biden-Harris administration's overall priority was to beat back what it saw as the great overriding challenge from China. And it seems that there are some voices within the administration. It's not often clear who these persons are, but that there are some people within the administration who see the problem, the challenge of China, as so vast and so severe that they understand that some kind of improvement of relations with Russia is essential in order to free up American resources from Europe and to transfer them to the Pacific, where they can confront China. And beyond that, there are also some American officials and some American commentators, I've discussed this in various programs, who are becoming increasingly worried and concerned about the growth and development of the Russian strategic partnership with China, a de facto alliance, as I've often discussed, and are becoming increasingly worried that this de facto alliance between China and Russia is putting the United States at an increasing disadvantage and is making specifically China less dependent on maritime trade routes for essential raw materials, which are essential to keep the Chinese economy operating, thereby depriving the United States of its principal leverage over China, which is the threat of a naval blockade. So the United States has become increasingly concerned about this. It's becoming worried that the Russian-Chinese strategic partnership is changing the balance of power at a time when the United States is facing a rising challenge from China. And it's also worried that the quarrel with Russia is tying up resources in Europe. American resources are becoming finite, and the United States wants to shift those resources away from from Europe so that they can confront China in the Pacific. Now, it's probably fair to say that not all of the officials in the United States government share these views. Many of them continue to have very strong anti-Russian feelings, and in fact there's been clearly some conflict within the United States administration between those who want to prioritize the challenge of China and those who want to continue with the policies towards Russia, and who apparently argue, and this seems to be their primary argument at the moment, that the way to deal with the Russians and to try to detach them from the Chinese is not to try to make concessions to them or to negotiate with them in a more civil way, but on the contrary, to redouble pressure on them to try to make the situation for the Russians so unbearable that they eventually fall into line. And that seems to be the current situation which we are in. And then a series of events took place in the spring which seemed to somewhat shift the balance within the administration towards those who were seeking a more conciliatory line with Moscow. Firstly, in April, there was a major build-up of Ukrainian forces along the contact line with the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and it seems that there were also some sort of attempts at that same time to try to engineer some kind of a coup in Belarus. And that was obviously the kind of policies that the hardliners, the anti-Russian hardliners, were seeking to follow. They wanted to create a crisis for Russia and Ukraine. They wanted to detach Belarus from Russia. All of this as part of the game of increasing pressure on Russia. But then things turned out otherwise from what these hardliners had expected. Firstly, the Russians responded to the build-up of Ukrainian forces on the contact line with the Donbass republics by building up on a much bigger scale their military forces on the Ukrainian border. And the Russians made it very clear that if there was a Ukrainian attack on the two Donbass republics, Russia would respond and there would be a war, and Ukraine itself would cease to exist. And Russian officials like Sergey Lavrov were saying that quite straightforwardly and quite openly. Secondly, the attempt at a coup in Belarus ended in total failure. All of the coup plotters in Belarus itself were rounded up and arrested. And since then, Belarus and Russia have been forging ahead with all sorts of military and economic cooperation projects which have drawn Belarus actually closer to Russia than it had previously been. And in the midst of this crisis in April and May, the United States, looking desperately for ways to de-escalate the crisis and to prevent a war in Ukraine which would end in a debacle for the United States, the United States arranged for the President, Joe Biden, to telephone President Putin, and a summit was agreed in Geneva in June, a summit meeting between Putin and Biden, which it must be said appears to have achieved virtually nothing. But at least the crisis that seemed to be brewing in Europe, which would have been such a disaster for the United States, that crisis seemed to have been averted. And the United States, since then, has found that whilst the situation in Europe has been a little calmer over the last few weeks since that summit meeting in Geneva, the situation with China in the Pacific continues to deteriorate. And of course, as I've discussed over the course of many programs, there have been strong words exchanged between China and the United States over Taiwan. There have been a series of failed meetings between senior US officials and Chinese officials, between people like Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and Wendy Sherman, and Chinese officials like Wang Yi and Yang Jiechi, which have got achieved nothing of substance, and we see that the Chinese are steadily building up their forces close to Taiwan, and they're now engaging in military exercises which appear to put the possibility of a Chinese attack on Taiwan very much on the prospective agenda. And by the way, as the military balance in the Pacific tilts further against the United States and its friends, and as the United States is becoming increasingly nervous about these Chinese moves, the Russians, for their part, have not been idle. They now have floated out 4 of the very advanced Yasen-class submarines. That's more than the analogous Seawolf-class submarines that the United States has, and they're apparently in the process of building 6 more. And the Russian defense minister has indicated that there might be more such submarines following upon those 10, which are either floated out or in the process of construction. And of course, the Russians have also been busy testing their Zircon anti-ship missile and developing all their various other programs, the Poseidon nuclear-powered submarine drone that I've discussed in previous programs, and all of those things. So there is a growing military crisis for the United States in the Arctic and the North Atlantic, happening in parallel to the growing military crisis for the United States in the Pacific. And on top of that, there is now in Europe an economic crisis as well. And it's an economic crisis that is affecting the entire global position and the global economy, because, as I've also discussed in various programs, the United States, through its massive overspending this year, has increased inflation, jacked up, which has led to a surge in energy prices and also to major energy shortfalls around the world, but especially in Europe, where the Europeans have anyway been mismanaging their energy policy now for a long time. And the result is that Europe could be facing a major energy crisis this winter, which it doesn't seem to know quite how to resolve, but in which the Russians seem to possess all the high cards. They are Europe's principal natural gas supplier, and by the way, they're also one of the world's major oil producers. Arguably, they've become the world's swing oil producer, and they're now exporting oil to the United States, and they may soon be exporting liquefied natural gas to the United States, with the United States now finding that it might start to become increasingly dependent on Russian energy policy in order to take some of the heat of the inflation crisis that is raging around the world. So instead of the United States finding itself in a dominant economic position with the Russians, where it is able to impose its will on the Russians via sanctions, what it has found instead, and somewhat to its embarrassment, is that on the contrary, for the moment at least, it is the Russians who seem in the stronger position. So, unsurprisingly, perhaps, the United States appears to have been trying over the last few weeks to resume some kind of diplomatic dialogue with Moscow. It needs to talk to Moscow about the deteriorating strategic balance between the United States and Russia, the fact that the Russians have all of these hypersonic systems that they're developing, their nuclear-powered submarine drones that they're developing, the fact that they're building up their naval forces in the Arctic and the North Atlantic. They need to talk with the Russians about energy policy, which is now becoming important for the United States itself and not just for Europe. And of course, they have to be worried about the festering crisis in eastern Ukraine, where there is now increasing potential for things to go hideously wrong and for a crisis to explode there, which would be as humiliating and disastrous for the United States as would a Chinese attack on Taiwan. And so for the last few weeks, the Americans have been lobbying to send a diplomatic representative to Moscow to meet with the top Russian leadership and to try to put relations on perhaps something more of an even keel. And those of you who have been following my programs closely will know that the United States has at times been trying to do the same with Beijing. They were trying for a long time to get a diplomatic representative, Wendy Sherman, to travel to China to meet with Chinese leaders there. And eventually, after a great deal of pressure and much resistance from China, Wendy Sherman did go to China, to Tianjin. But instead of having negotiations with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, as she expected, she was only able to meet with low-ranking officials, and all those officials apparently did was hand her out a list of demands which the United States needed to satisfy in order to bring negotiations on an even keel. The United States was so upset and embarrassed by Wendy Sherman's failure in China that they turned round and pretended that she did negotiate with Wang Yi after all, even though in reality she only had a brief meeting with him. It was a bizarre readout, one of the strangest I have ever seen, published by the State Department or indeed by any foreign ministry. So that was a debacle, and it's now been followed by a further debacle of a meeting between Jake Sullivan, President Biden's national security advisor, and Yang Jiechi, President Xi's national security advisor in Zurich, where again the United States found that the Chinese are proving to be completely unyielding on any matter involving bilateral relations. So the United States, having failed with China, but having managed to persuade the Chinese to receive their emissary, found that that ended in a debacle, but they've tried the same trick with Russia. They've tried to persuade the Russians to receive their emissary and to try to hold talks with this person in Moscow and to try to get this person to talk to the senior Russian leadership in order to try to make progress with the Russians on various things. Unfortunately, the United States, just as it picked in Wendy Sherman, a completely inappropriate person to send to China, hit upon possibly the worst possible person to send to Moscow, and that person is Victoria-Nuland. Now, it's perhaps impossible to exaggerate the strong feelings the Russians have about Victoria-Nuland. They see her as a dyed-in-the-wool neocon, somebody who is married to Robert Kagan, the high priest of the neocons in Washington in the United States, and that would already make them distrust her. But over and above and beyond that, there is a further factor, which is that as far as they're concerned, Victoria-Nuland is not only a neocon and one known to be deeply antagonistic to Russia and to the present Russian government, but is also somebody who, as the Russians have never forgotten, played a central role in the Maidan events in Ukraine in 2014, which resulted in the ouster of the democratically elected president Viktor Yanukovych and his replacement by a Ukrainian government that was viscerally hostile to Russia. And in fact, Victoria-Nuland, over the course of those events, walked round Maidan Square, handed out cookies to the anti-Yanukovych protesters, and was caught on her mobile phone, almost certainly by Russian intelligence, chatting with US Ambassador Jeffrey Pyatt and picking the members of the future anti-Russian, pro-US, pro-EU Ukrainian government. So that has made Victoria Nuland persona non grata in Moscow. Not just persona non grata, but she has actually been put on a Russian sanctions list, which has prevented her from travelling to Russia. And that was a bizarre choice of person, therefore, to send to Moscow. And by the way, it was a bizarre choice to appoint such a person to that particular role of Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, given that she is persona non grata in Moscow. And the Russians were extremely unwilling to receive Victoria Nuland in Moscow, and that's putting it mildly. And apparently they've had to be protracted negotiations to try to get the Russians to receive her. And one condition that the Russians made, and which the United States was forced apparently to concede, was that in return for the Russians allowing Victoria Nuland to come to Moscow, she was forced or obliged to, the Americans were forced or obliged to agree that she would also, that they would also lift sanctions on various Russian officials that the US has imposed sanctions upon. We don't know who those officials are, but after a lot of haggling and discussion, apparently the Americans did lift sanctions and the Russians agreed to lift sanctions on Nuland and receive her in Moscow. Though importantly, and repeating the pattern of Wendy Sherman's visit to China, she is not, as she might have expected, meeting with the very top officials of the Russian government. She's not meeting with President Putin. She's not meeting with Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov. Her main interlocutor is Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergey Ryabkov, though she will also apparently meet with one of Putin's aides, a man called Yuri Yushakov, who is an advisor to Putin on foreign affairs. And she will also meet with the Deputy Chief of Staff of the Presidential Executive Office, Dmitry Kozak. He's an official, by the way, who is primarily concerned with energy policy. So that is the people that the United States, that Nuland will be meeting in Moscow. And she's now come to Moscow, and the discussions there are supposed to last apparently for several days, but she's already had a first meeting with Sergey Ryabkov, and that meeting has gone extremely badly. In fact, the Russians are openly talking about a debacle. And again, this reminds me very much of the Wendy Sherman visit, when Wendy Sherman came to China, and that meeting ended badly. And in fact, we now have a readout of the meeting between Nuland and Ryabkov from the Russian Foreign Ministry. The United States, the State Department has not provided its own readout. All it says is that Nuland is on a diplomatic tour taking in Moscow, Lebanon and London. Something, by the way, which will annoy the Russians, because it looks as if the Americans are consulting with the British on US-Russia relations. And of course, the Russians at the moment have extremely bad relations with the British, to put it mildly. But anyway, and regardless, Nuland, the Americans have not provided a separate readout about Nuland's discussions with the Russians, at least not to date. But the Russians have, and this is what it says. On October 12th, Deputy Foreign Minister Sergey Ryabkov met with US Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs Victoria Nuland. The officials discussed the status and prospects of bilateral relations. They paid special attention to the operation of diplomatic missions on each other's territory. Mr. Ryabkov emphasized that the hostile anti-Russian actions will not remain unanswered, although Moscow does not seek to further escalate tensions. He suggested removing all restrictions that both sides have introduced in the past few years. Miss Nuland was told that the continuation of Washington's line toward confrontation on the bilateral agenda and in the context of acute international and regional problems can only result in the further degradation of Russia-US relations. It is necessary to adopt a realistic approach and build bilateral ties on the principles of equality and mutual consideration of each other's interests. Deputy Defense Minister Colonel General Alexander Fomin also took part in the meeting. So that is a very tough readout. Note that it doesn't say anything about any of the comments that Nuland herself made over the course of the meeting. It doesn't give any mention, there's no mention here of the atmosphere in which the meeting took place, suggesting that it was so bad that the Russians don't want to mention how bad it was because they don't want the situation to escalate even further, as indeed the readout says. But note also, and I'm going to come to that later, that a Russian military official, Colonel General Alexander Fomin, also took part in the meeting. But anyway, the key issue, the key point that was discussed, if one is to believe this readout, is the status of diplomatic missions and diplomatic property in the United States and Russia. And here I think a little history is needed in order to explain what's happening. Briefly, going back to 2016, at the height of the Russiagate furore, President Obama, as he then still was, passed all sorts of decisions affecting the status of Russian diplomatic missions in the United States. Several of them were closed down. Russian diplomats were expelled from the United States, and on top of that, a lot of US diplomatic property was seized. Russian diplomatic property was seized. The United States has also been imposing visa restrictions on Russian diplomats who attend both the embassies in Washington and, by the way, the Russian diplomatic mission in New York, which participates in the work of the UN General Assembly and the United Nations Security Council. So, as a result, the Russians have imposed retaliatory action of their own. They've also closed down multiple US diplomatic missions across Russia. They've expelled large numbers of US diplomats. They've also, by the way, withdrawn technical support, including administrative staff from the US Embassy in Washington. And that has apparently put that embassy in Washington in deep crisis, and it has also incidentally meant that the US intelligence operation in Russia, it's the US attempt to establish or to recruit Russians and to run agents in Russia, has all but collapsed. The CIA recently published a rather bitter comment circulated to all CIA stations, lamenting that there's been multiple arrests of CIA agents across the world, specifically in Russia, but also in China and in other places too. And I'm sure that part of the reason for that, at least in Russian terms, is the fact that, as I said, the CIA operation in Russia appears to have all but collapsed. And this has created much anguish, as I understand it, in Washington. And there have even been some US senators who have called upon the Biden administration to expel 300 Russian diplomats from the United States. The Russians have ridiculed that comment and have said that there aren't in fact that many Russian diplomats left in the United States, but they've also made it clear that if anything like that does happen, then they will retaliate. And as this readout says, it's quite possible that there will be a further degradation in relations with the Russians, talking openly about a situation where if all of their diplomats are expelled from the United States, all American diplomats will also and in turn be expelled from Russia, leaving the United States and Russia with no diplomatic contacts with each other. So the Russians have brought up, and they've been repeatedly bringing this up in discussion after discussion with the Americans. They say that all restrictions on Russian diplomatic representation in the United States must be lifted. The Russians must be allowed to re-equip their consulates and staffs. All their diplomatic property must be returned to them. In return, they will agree to lift the restrictions on American missions in Russia, and that this is a litmus test for relations. Unless the United States is prepared to do that, then relations between Washington and Moscow will continue to go from bad to worse. There will be no improvement in relations between the two countries. On the contrary, relations will continue to deteriorate with all the problems which we have seen and talked about at such length already in this program. And it seems clear that Ryabkov brought this all up with Nuland over the course of this meeting. And it's striking that the readout, the Russian readout, says nothing at all about how Nuland responded, and all we get, in fact, is a comment that Nuland has said that she was glad to be back in Russia to deal with bilateral relations, and that's apparently all that we've learned about her, and about the only thing that's come of any substance from the American side. But we learn from the Russians that, in fact, she turned a deaf ear to all the discussions about diplomatic missions, apparently incapable of realizing or understanding the extent to which this is a litmus test for the Russians. And here is what we read that Ryabkov said in a television interview, in which he went further and spoke at even greater length about the kind of problems that that Russia has with the United States, and about the actual direction of relations, and about the talks he had with Nuland specifically. And Ryabkov, after those talks and in discussion with these talks, said the following: I cannot say that we have made great progress. The topics of visas, the operating conditions of diplomatic missions, the rotation of diplomatic staff, the overall normalization of the activities of Russian foreign missions in the United States and the United States in Russia retain a significant crisis potential, and it cannot be ruled out that some further exacerbations are possible in these areas. The positions of the parties do not fit well. Americans do not listen to our logic and our demands, but nevertheless, the conversation was useful. So, in other words, the meeting was a dialogue of the deaf. Nuland came along, no doubt with her ideas of what she wanted to talk about. Ukraine, no doubt. Strategic arms talks, the situation with respect to energy. But instead of any progress made, it all got bogged down in a discussion about diplomatic missions without Nuland appearing to understand, or perhaps being able to understand, that for Russians this is a litmus test, and unless there is some movement on this issue, there will not be significant movement on any other topic either. And again, this reminds me very much of the meeting in Tianjin between Wendy Sherman and those Chinese officials. Wendy Sherman came along, apparently hoping and expecting to achieve some kind of substantive talk with the Chinese, only to be handed with a list of demands by the Chinese and going away baffled, with the United States becoming increasingly concerned that its diplomacy with China is going nowhere, with the president wheeled out to speak to Xi Jinping himself over a phone, but also finding it all but impossible to get the Chinese, to get Xi Jinping to shift, and with a further deadlock in a difficult meeting between Jake Sullivan and Yang Jiechi in Zurich, which I've just covered in a recent video. And it's the same pattern is now reproducing itself between the United States and the Russians. The Americans push incredibly hard to send a diplomat to Russia, just as they send a diplomat to China. They pick the person who's likely to raise the biggest hackles in Moscow, just as Wendy Sherman was somebody who was bound to raise hackles in Beijing. That person came empty-handed with no substantive offers to make to the Chinese, to the Russians rather, on anything of importance, just as Wendy Sherman went to China without anything useful to offer to the Chinese of importance. In both cases, the Americans continue to be tied down to this idea that it is for the other side, for the Russians and for the Chinese, to work with the Americans on those topics that the Americans consider to be useful and important, but that the United States has no interest in talking to Russia or China on the topics of concern to those countries. And of course, on those sort of topics, one of the key ones, and I suspect one of the reasons why Colonel General Fomin was involved in those discussions, are strategic arms and the issue of Ukraine. And of course, Fomin's presence is a reminder to Nuland that in terms of the strategic balance, the overall balance of power is gradually shifting against the United States, and that the Russians are always in that position to make to wage war in Ukraine in a situation where there would be a disaster for Ukraine and indeed by extension for the United States were that ever to happen. And we learn that on Ukraine the Russians also have been taking the hardest possible line. And this isn't just from the fact that there's been no mention of Ukraine in these readouts between the readout that the Russians have published of their talks with Nuland, even though I'm sure Nuland have brought up the question of Ukraine. In fact, and I am sure that this is not a coincidence, at the same time as Nuland was heading to Moscow, the two European leaders, Merkel and Macron, were also talking to President Putin, no less, on Ukraine-related topics. But they found Putin again unmovable on this issue. And the Kremlin has provided a readout of those talks, these telephone talks. And that readout reads as follows. The worrying statement in the effort to end the internal conflict in Ukraine was discussed in detail with the three leaders, President Putin, President Macron, and Chancellor Merkel, noting the importance of implementing the 2015 Minsk agreements as the only possible basis for a settlement. Interest was also expressed in further coordinating efforts in the Normandy format of Russia, Germany, and France. The President of Russia offered a principled assessment of the course of action pursued by the Kiev authorities, which refused to honour their commitments under the Minsk agreements and accords reached at the previous Normandy summits, including the one in Paris on December 9th, 2019. Considering the difficulty of settling the conflict in the southeast of Ukraine, the leaders instructed their political advisers and foreign ministries to step up contacts and work in the Normandy 4 format, resulting in a meeting at the level of foreign ministers in this format. The leaders also agreed to continue to use different channels to evaluate conditions for convening another Normandy summit if need be. Other international issues were discussed during the call, including counter-terrorism efforts on the African continent. The latter, by the way, refers to the situation in Mali, which will be the subject of a different video. Note that there is no reference in this readout again to anything about the atmosphere in which this conversation took place, suggesting that it was a tense one. But the key point to take away is that again, Putin refused to budge, was not willing to budge. He said that the people he calls the Kiev authorities, in other words, the Ukrainian government, notice how he calls them the Kiev authorities, implying that they do not possess legitimacy in Ukraine, refuse to honour their commitments under the Minsk agreements. That's true, by the way. And that in the light of this, the situation is in worrying stalemate. He also made it clear that it is for the Ukrainians to move on this position. And it's quite clear that Macron and Merkel were trying to look for some kind of a summit meeting between themselves and Putin and Zelensky as well, but that Putin flatly refused. All they're going to get is a meeting of foreign ministers, and there might be a meeting in the future. The words are to evaluate conditions for convening another Normandy summit if need be, but clearly no progress was made. So the Europeans, caught in an energy crisis in which they have to rely on the Russians for gas, find themselves trying to make progress on the topic of Ukraine with the Russians, but they find that the Russians are not prepared to shift from their existing positions. And Nuland goes to Moscow, also trying to get the Russians to talk on issues relevant and important to the United States, but discovers that the Russians have their own agenda, one she's unprepared or unwilling to talk about, with the result that the discussions end in complete deadlock. So what are we to conclude from all of this? Well, I'm going to go back to that original Russian readout, and the key words are in that readout, they're these: that it is necessary to adopt a realistic approach and build bilateral ties on the principles of equality and mutual consideration of each other's interests. That is what the United States and the Europeans are not prepared to do, either with respect to China or with respect to Russia. They're not prepared to work on the basis of equality with these countries, and they're not prepared to take into account the interests of these countries. They refuse to acknowledge that the Chinese and the Russians have their red lines, and they refuse to respect those red lines. They are prepared to talk with the Chinese and the Russians on those topics that are of interest to themselves, but they're not so far prepared to talk with these countries on those topics that are of interest to the Chinese and the Russians. Certainly, they're not so far prepared to make any concessions. They make token references with respect to China, to respecting the One China policy, which appears to recognize Taiwan as part of China, but all their actions speak the contrary. They're prepared to talk to the Russians about the fact that the only way forward to solving the Ukraine crisis are the Minsk agreements, but they are not prepared to put any pressure on Ukraine to abide by the Minsk agreements, even though they know perfectly well that it is Ukraine, not Russia, which is not abiding by the Minsk agreements. So the result is deadlock. Deadlock in relation with China, deadlock in relations with Russia. Now, all of this would be bad enough in itself, given that both China and Russia are nuclear powers. But it seems to me an incredibly strange, indeed, I'm going to say it straightforwardly, even illogical, and notice that Ryabkov used the word logic, or rather lack of logic, when discussing his interactions with Nuland. Illogical, perhaps some would say even irrational approach to take a hard line with the Chinese and the Russians on issues like Taiwan, Ukraine, diplomatic representation, and all the rest, when the balance of power is in fact shifting in favor of these countries and against the United States and the Europeans. The Europeans and the Americans were absolutely shocked back in April when it appeared that the Russians might be prepared to go to war against Ukraine. In fact, the Russians quite emphatically said that they were prepared to go to war over Ukraine, and the Americans and the Europeans realized that if there was such a war, Ukraine would be defeated and would be destroyed, and that there was nothing they could realistically do. They've also discovered over the last couple of months that far from being in a position of economic advantage with the Russians, it is the Russians who have an economic advantage over them. Europe is in the middle of an energy crisis. The United States is importing oil and perhaps before very long gas from Russia. The Europeans and the Americans need Russia to cooperate on energy issues and energy pricing in order to damp down the current inflation crisis, which is raging. But instead of acknowledging this reality that in fact the economic balance is shifting in Russia's favor, they continue to threaten Russia with economic sanctions, which are always proving and consistently proving less and less effective. In fact, the Russian economy is not only growing, it's due to grow at a rate of about 4.3% increase in GDP this year, but it's likely to continue to grow faster over the next few years, despite all the sanctions pressure that the United States and the Europeans have exerted against it. And of course, in the Pacific, we see a similar crisis now developing, with the Chinese in a position increasingly where they're preparing and even rehearsing an attack on Taiwan. And again, there doesn't seem to be very much that the United States can do in response. So given that this is so, given that we are in a position of disadvantage, it hardly makes much sense, or so it seems to me, to refuse to negotiate with the Chinese and the Russians on those topics that concern the Chinese and the Russians, and to refuse to make any kind of concessions and moves towards them. And yet that is what the United States insists on doing, and that is what the Europeans insist on doing. I wonder how much longer this hardline position can be persisted with and can survive. My guess is that at some point, perhaps in the next year, perhaps it'll take a little longer, the penny will eventually drop and we will be in a severe crisis, and then at that point negotiations on Ukraine, on energy, on Taiwan will begin in earnest. But nobody should be in any doubt at all that if we postpone to that point, then of course by then the balance of power will have shifted against us in the West even more, and that the price the Chinese and the Russians will exact will be even steeper than the one they're demanding now. It will go beyond questions like diplomatic missions, the status of diplomatic missions, and adhesion to one China policies if we continue to take a hard line. In a few years' time, the Chinese and the Russians might start demanding more substantial concessions on more substantive issues. Well, it seems to me that for the moment, it's quite clear that we in the West, in Washington, in Brussels, in Paris, in Berlin, and of course in London, are not prepared to make those substantive concessions. Our relations are in stalemate and deadlock, and things are going to continue going from bad to worse. The Russians are talking about a further degradation of relations. The Chinese are talking about the same thing. Let's hope at least that a war, a military conflict in Ukraine or in the Pacific at least can be avoided. But for my part, I am not sanguine that that will be so. Thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me on future programs on this channel, and also on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. You can also, by the way, and should also, by the way, check out his channel. You will find links under this video. Please also remember to go to our main channel, Locals, which you will find our other channel, Locals, big channel Locals, which you will find under this links under this video. We have a thriving community there. We're publishing exclusive content increasingly there, and you can also join and participate directly in the discussions which take place there and interact directly with Alex and me there. So look us up on Locals, look us also up on our other platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, and above all, SuperU, the new free speech platform, which is also going from strength to strength and which we're also very excited about. If you want to support us, you can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. And remember to check out our shop, look up the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. Lastly, if you like this video, please remember to press the like button, and please also check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a wonderful day until then.